The First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles are covering a sexual predator that lives in your ward. His name is Joseph Bishop. He was the MTC president in 1984 when he raped me in the basement of the MTC. If you're not aware of this, thank you. Yeah, I'll be done in just a minute. I will. Thank you.
I'd love to talk to you afterwards.
Okay.
Can I talk to
However,
you?
absolutely, I'd love to talk to you afterwards.
Okay, please.
However, for the atonement to take place, we have to be accountable for what we do. We don't get to.
I'd
Thank
like to
you.
talk to you, okay?
But you know what? You're in my personal space.
Okay.
No. I have more to say. My name is
You're welcome
McKenna
to share with
Jensen.
me. Okay.
I approve this
You're welcome to share
message.
with me.
I will share with you.
I'd like
However,
to share with you
it is
okay.
really important. It is really important that you understand. In order to keep our ward safe, in order to keep our church safe, do not call the police. Don't touch me. You're assaulting me. In order to keep the church safe, we need to hold sexual predators accountable, whether they are pedophiles or whether they are rapists like Joseph Bishop.
I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santa Maria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism.
The Serial Mormon History Podcast. The great backstabbing had begun. Everybody was suspicious of their neighbor. Who would be the next to strike? Who would be the next to take a knife? John C. Reckett Bennett's public and vitriolic opposition to the leadership in Nauvoo was quickly turning into a meltdown for the leadership. Thousands were murmuring about the doctrine of plural marriage being practiced by select Mormon elites, of course. Hundreds had some evidence to substantiate these rumors, but only a few dozen people were privy to the knowledge that plural marriage was indeed a divine commandment of God, and that it was being practiced. Bennett's disaffection caused everybody to look at each other with shifty eyes. Who else was under the guise of sincere belief for the purposes of exposing illegal church practices? Who could be trusted? Who would be the next to depart from the highest ranks and then stab the brethren in the back? The 21st May 1842 WASP summarized it well in a snippet called The Shortest Way to Murder Character. The editor, Joe's younger brother, Crazy Willey Smith, knew how hard it is to put down rumors once implanted in the collective consciousness of a society. Quote, "Profess your friendship for a man. Tell him how much you love him. Proclaim how many excellent qualities he possesses, and with a very sanctified look and impressive sigh, express your fear that all is not as it should be. Whisper suspicion, and let conjecture with giant strength work out the ruin. He who understands human nature in its deeper workings of damnable cruelty and selfish artifice, says a certain shrewd writer will mark the man who stabs another under the cloak of pretended affection. The pretense has a lie, adds he, on the face of it. True affection would never whisper a suspicion, save in the ear of the one beloved, and whom that suspicion concerned. Never trust that man who comes to you whining over his regard for another, while his tongue is a drawn sword to wound and kill. Meet him promptly with the charge of his hypocrisy, and he will sink with meanness before you." End quote. How could you know? How does a person know when somebody joins their organization for the express purpose of infiltration and exposing what goes on behind closed doors? How do you tell the difference between pretended affection and genuine? How could Joe know if the next convert was a Bennett or a Brigham? The problem for men practicing polygamy and trying to keep it under wraps was largely the women. I mean, it's funny how that works. You treat half of the population as a commodity, subject to your every whim with no legitimate power to affect change or influence politics, and they get sick and tired of it and start talking amongst themselves. What we're going to discuss today is a bit of the interplay between the newly formed women's organization, the Relief Society, and the long-standing men's organization governing everybody, the church hierarchy. These are our actors for today, and the catalyst for conflict is the same as it's been for the past few weeks: polygamy. And look, this podcast is about Mormon history, and we talk about issues impacting the early church as they come along. Polygamy and the accusations of adultery were completely ruling and shaping every action in the church in spring to summer of 1842, which means we'll try and examine it from as many angles as we can to contextualize the impact of polygamy in 1842. It's complex. It can't be dealt with in an episode or two and then just take a back seat to the historical timeline, because polygamy and the associated decisions truly did shape so much of Mormonism in this Nauvoo era. What we see play out in the record of public documents is the Brethren leveraging their platforms to try and stifle or control how much people were talking about polygamy. They wanted the problem to go away. On the women's side, we have the Relief Society creating a hotbed for these rumors to circulate and be confirmed. It's a common anti-Mormon throwaway that, Joe preached to the Relief Society that he can only get one wife while 19 of his wives were sitting in the room. And, that's funny and it's a fact and all, but the point is always so much more complicated than that. By June of 1842, his wives were the President, Emma, Counselor Sarah M. Cleveland, Counselor Sarah Ann Whitney, Secretary Eliza R. Snow, and the primary movers in the society were Agnes Coolbrith Smith. That was passed from Don Carlos Smith to Joseph Smith when Don Carlos had died a few months prior. Then we have Zina Huntington, Patty Sessions, and Prescindia Huntington Buell. Those were some of the main movers and shakers in the Relief Society, and the minutes detail most of them making speeches or proposing motions, and Joe had taken all of them to wife by June of 1842. The Relief Society was created for so many reasons, all right? One of those was to bring women together into a cohesive body so that they can take care of each other. And, let's be clear about this, police each other. When every single woman in the highest ranks of leadership was one of Joe's wives, with his first wife as president of the society, that creates a complex mess of power dynamics that I don't think anybody could reasonably tease apart. So let's start with the messages that the Brethren were sending to the women in a few articles printed in The Wasp. The Times and Seasons, that was the official church periodical. The Wasp was the independent propagandist rag that was edited by Joe's younger brother, Crazy Willey Smith. Let's start with the 21st May issue with a pleasant little article titled Wives. Quote, "Women should be acquainted that no beauty hath any charms but the inward one of the mind, and that a gracefulness in their manners is much more engaging than that of their person, to be seen and not heard. That modesty and meekness are the true and lasting ornaments, for she that has these is qualified, as she ought to be, for the management of a family, for the education of children, for the affection of her husband, and submitting to a prudent way of living. These only are the charms that render wives amiable, and give them the best title to our respect." End quote. Respect is earned, William Smith. It's a two-way street. The next issue of The Wasp has an article titled The Wife. It tells women what is expected by the man in order to not break his heart. Quote, "It needs not guilt to break a husband's heart, the absence of content, the mutterings of spleen, the untidy dress and cheerless home, the forbidden scowl and deserted hearth. These and other nameless neglects, without a crime among them, have harrowed to the quick, therefore, a many a man, and planted there beyond the reach of cure the gloom of dark despair. Oh, may woman, before that sad sight arrives, dwell on the recollections of her youth, and awake and keep alive the promises she then so kindly gave, and though she may be injured, not the injuring one, the forgotten, not the forgetful wife, a happy allusion to that hour of peace and love, a kindly welcome to that comfortable home, a smile of love to banish hostile words, a kiss of peace to pardon all the past, and the hardest heart that ever locked itself within the breast of a selfish man will soften to her Sharons, and bid her live, as she had hoped, her years in matchless bliss, loved, loving, and content, the soother in the sorrowing hour, the source of comfort, and the spring of joy. End quote. Stop arguing with your husband's wives. That's all these are. They're patronizing. And now for the crowning jewel from Crazy Willey. This may be one of the most patronizing and condescending articles I've ever read from a church propaganda outlet. But that's more due to the social context from which it was printed. I'll allow you to judge this for yourself. It's titled The Truant Husband. The story really speaks for itself, but I'm going to break it up with some of my own commentary to make it a little bit more palpable. It's kind of long, but this reads like Crazy Willey's objectified idea of a perfect wife. Now remember, Willey was a bit of a party freak, even more so than his older brother Joe, which that's really saying something. The Truant Husband. It was past midnight, and she sat leaning her pale cheek on her hand, counting the dull ticking of a French clock that stood on the marble chimney-piece, and ever and anon lifting her weary eye to its dial to mark the lapse of another hour. It was past midnight, and yet he returned not. She arose, and taking up the lamp, whose pale rays alone illuminated the solitary chamber, proceeded with noiseless steps to a small inner apartment. The curtains of his little bed were drawn aside, and the young mother gazed on her sleeping child. What a vivid contrast did that glowing cheek and smiling brow present, as he lay in rosy slumber, to the faded yet beautiful face that hung over him in tears. Will he resemble his father? Was the thought that passed for a moment through her devoted heart, and a sigh was the only answer. 'Tis his well-known knock, and the steps of the drowsy porter echoed through the lofty hall, as with a murmur on his lip. He drew the massy bolts and admitted his thoughtless master. 4 o'clock, Willis, is it not? And he sprang up the staircase. Another moment he is in the chamber, in her arms. No reproaches met the truant husband, none save those she could not spare him in her heavy eye and faded cheek. Yet these spoke to his heart. Julia, I have been a wandering husband. But you are home now, Charles, and all is well. All is well, for from that hour, Charles Danvers became an altered man. Had his wife met him with frowns and sullen tears, he had become a hardened libertine. But her affectionate caresses, the joy that danced in her sunken eye, the hectic flash that lit up her pallid cheek at his approach, were arguments he could not withstand. So let's just deal with that for a second. So when your husband comes home at 4 a.m, don't you dare ask questions, or he's going to stop loving you. Just deal with that whiskey dick. And of course, there's an explanation for Charles' truancy, and it's explained in this lovely little anecdote. Married in early life, while he had felt all the ardor but not the esteem of love, possessed of a splendid fortune, and having hitherto had the command of his own pleasures, Danvers fell into the common error of newly married men, the dread of being controlled. In vain did his parents, who beheld with sorrow the reproaches and misery he was heaping up for himself, in after life remonstrate. Charles Danvers turned a deaf ear to advice, and pursued with companions every way unworthy of his society the path of folly, if not of absolute guilt. The tavern, the clubroom, and the race course too often left his wife a solitary mourner or a midnight watcher. A midnight watcher. Thus the first 3 years of their wedded life had passed, to him in fervid and restless pleasure, to her in blighted hope or unmurmuring regret. But this night crowned the patient forbearance of the neglected Julia with a just reward, and gave the death blow to folly in the bosom of Danvers. Returning with disgust from the losses of the hazard table, her meekness and long-suffering touched him to the soul. The film fell from his eyes, and vice, in her own hideous deformity, stood unmasked before him. Yeah, Poor Charles Danvers, poor Chuck. Just lost all of his money at the gambling tables in the local tavern. He feels controlled by his wife, pushed into a marriage that he didn't want at the advice of his parents, only wanting to be a free spirit to control his own decisions. But lucky for him, when he gets home at 4 a.m. to his sleeping sick child and wife who's been awake all night, a midnight watcher waiting for him to get home, she doesn't ask any questions or try to find out where he's been. She doesn't ask where all the money is. Like a good wife in the spirit of meekness and affection. She doesn't even ask if he's actually gambled away all of their money again and where they're going to get their next meal. She just gives him a tearful hug and she's glad that he's home. God knows if she complains that he's just going to leave her and the kids because he feels too controlled, so it's definitely in her best interest to just bite down on that unruly member of a tongue and never speak ill to her husband. Julia, just such a model wife, isn't she? Happily for everybody, her not asking questions of her husband worked out for everybody. 10 years have passed since that solitary midnight when the young matron bent in tears over her sleeping boy. Behold her now, still in the pride of womanhood, surrounded by their cherub faces who are listening ere they go to rest to her sweet voice as it pours forth to the accompaniment of her harp, an evening song of joy and melody, while a manly form is bending over the music page to hide the tears of happiness and triumph that sprang from a swelling bosom as he contemplated the interesting group. His family, that interesting group. And of course, the article concludes with a nice little public service announcement for all young matrons out there looking to chastise their husband when he returns at 4 a.m. without explanation. Youthful matrons, ye who watch over a wandering and erring heart, when a reproach trembles on your lips towards a truant husband, imitate Julia Danvers. And remember, though Hymen has chains like the sword of Hermodius, they may be covered with flowers. That unkindness and irritability do but harden, if not wholly estrange the heart, while on the contrary, patience and gentleness of manner, as water dropping on the flinty rock will in time wear it into softness, seldom fail to reclaim to happiness and virtue the truant husband. Yeah, look, I mean, the article speaks for itself, stand alone, but when you consider the context of all of the rumors gripping Nauvoo at the time and the brethren constantly putting out fires, and the existence of brothels and saloons in Nauvoo, it all takes on a new dimension. Beyond that, I can't say that this article is something which was published in direct response to the Bennett scandal that was currently underway, because that article honestly could have been printed just about anywhere in America at this time in the 1840s. And quite frankly, there are plenty of articles and stories like this printed every day and broadcast to millions of people at the click of a button today. The inherent sexism within the story is worth decrying on its own merits, and it's a shame that I can't even say that this was a product of its time. The important piece to consider here is the context during which this story was printed. It reads like a snuff piece. Wives, stop asking your truant husbands all those probing questions or he's going to stop loving you. So let's take our focus off of the brethren and shift it a little bit here, because I don't want you to come away from today's episode with the wrong impressions. So let's hone in on the Relief Society for a minute and its role in Nauvoo Mormonism. In spite of the way that I've painted it this far, in many ways, Nauvoo was a weird experimentation of early women's rights. Now, let me qualify that a bit, because everything I've said today so far makes what was going on in Nauvoo at this time make it sound like the Relief Society was created for the sole purpose of just shutting up those wives who couldn't keep their mouths shut about polygamy. But that's laughably reductionist and simplistic. So let's discuss the Relief Society in light of women's rights movements of the day within Nauvoo Mormonism. On the one hand, Nauvoo was only able to survive with the contributions by the women and their untiring devotion to the cause, and providing for the destitute Mormons in their time of need. One partial reason the Relief Society was formed was as a kind of a reward for doing so much to build Zion in their own way for the women. I mean, look, these women had been building Zion in ways that we can't imagine within the confines of their gender roles that society had dictated. And when we think about this, building Zion, the actual like major structural pieces of construction projects, yeah, those were carried out largely by men, cutting the lumber and stone and firing bricks and everything, all of the hard labor that you can imagine to get a structure built. But once the structure was up, it was just a skeleton of a building. And this goes for every construction project in Kirtland, in Missouri, in Nauvoo. Who do you think built a ton of the furniture and upholstered it, sewed the rugs, sewed the curtains, designed the interior to look the way that it was? Who do you think kept all of the thousands of men and children fed during all of these construction projects? Who was tending to small farming operations and taking care of livestock while the men were occupied with construction? And sure, the men usually farmed like the cash crops and hired those out, but small gardens and private farming operations just to feed families? Who educated all the kids? And laundry was a multiple days long chore, depending on how big the family was. Who did all of that amidst cooking and child rearing duties and was then expected to have a fresh loaf of cornbread and stew in the fireplace when daddy comes home from building temples all day? I mean, women in Mormon history were the unseen force that kept society afloat, okay? Maybe it was time they finally had some power and say in what happens. So after years of contributing to the collective Mormon effort and building Zion, the Relief Society was formed, which granted women that ability to meet together and then lobby their efforts and channel them as a cohesive singular group. They could finally work together in solidarity and meet with the prophet and his wife on a weekly or semi-weekly basis to voice their concerns or to talk about what's been going on in Nauvoo lately. For a few hours a week, they could get away from the kids and husband and all the never-ending chores and just get to hang out with friends and be a support group for each other. What an incredible thing, right? And truly, that is progressive for its day. I can't stress this enough. Now, women's organizations were a revolutionary time in American history, and Nauvoo Mormonism was part of that movement. So let's view this revolution in the broader context. A few women's organizations existed at the time. So let's use the complaints that Emma voiced in the first Relief Society meeting to put the Relief Society in its time and place of American history. Emma's criticisms of the naming stood as an important criticisms of many of the women's societies of that day. So let me back up a little bit. When Joseph Smith and John Taylor were trying to name the Relief Society the Nauvoo Benevolent Society, Emma's objections revealed these criticisms of women's organizations of the day that I'm talking about. Quote, Emma Smith said the popularity of the word benevolent is one great objection. No person can think of the word as associated with public institutions without thinking the Washingtonian Benevolent Society, which was one of the most corrupt institutions of the day. Do not wish to have it called after other societies in the world. End quote. That was from the first Nauvoo Relief Society minutes. It can't be argued that these benevolent societies or the Relief Society, when it comes to Mormonism, weren't beneficial in so many ways. The subject is really complex. They accomplished social change at the behest of groups of women, a phenomenon which had never happened in Western history before, with just a very few minor exceptions. Now, Ruth Alexander wrote of the importance of benevolent societies as a social safety net in the period from the 1840s to the 1850s. This article is titled, "We Are Engaged as a Band of Sisters, Class and Domesticity in the Washingtonian Temperance Movement 1840 to 1850. You're going to find a link to this article in the show notes, and it is fascinating. But here are a couple of extracts. Quote, throughout the winter and spring of 1842, the women of the Ladies' Chelsea Temperance Benevolent Society visited the houses, alleys, and streets of their Manhattan neighborhood, searching for families and individuals who suffered from the ravages of alcohol. Led by directress Bowerson, the Chelsea devotees of the Washingtonian temperance movement offered cash, clothing, and the message of abstinence from alcohol to impoverished inebriates. Among those aided were 3 women restored to sobriety by the actions of the female Washingtonians. The first woman was destitute, drunk, quote, nearly naked and sick from exposure, end quote, when members of the society found her. She was persuaded to take the pledge of total abstinence. Food and medical care were provided for her, and society members helped her find employment and board. Later, she became a worthy member of the organization. The second, a young woman who was destitute and without friends, took the pledge and was clothed, boarded, and assisted in obtaining work with a sympathetic family. The third, a mother so poor and drunken that local authorities had taken her child from her, was able to resume care of her family after receiving help from the Washingtonian women. Ruth Alexander further sums up the benefits of these societies and social movements that were fostered within the societies, including the temperance movement, as follows, quote, feminine modesty, charity, the rescue of destitute or degraded females, or sex workers, and attentiveness to the reform of personal habits, all evident in the report from the Ladies' Chelsea Temperance Benevolence Society, were common features of the reform efforts spearheaded by middle-class women during the 19th century. Numerous historians have asserted that this enthusiastic activism was inspired in part by middle-class women's adherence to the tenets of domesticity, an ideology that sharply differentiated the public world of men from the private world of women, and yet ultimately prompted many matrons to take their message of moral probity into the temperance, moral reform, anti-slavery, and women's rights movements. End quote. Another historian by the name of Keith Melder articulates the rise of women's benevolent societies and notes how difficult it is to chart their rise. Most of these benevolent societies were formed to increase circulation of Bibles and interfaith proselytization to Native Americans. That was a common sentiment shared by the majority of Protestant Christian sects in early America. The unwashed Native population required conversion to Christianity to complete the colonialization of the American continent. So, people like Joseph Smith wrote books about their supposed Christian heritage in hopes of converting these natives. However, Christianizing the natives was a dogmatic ideology long before Joseph Smith was even born. So these female Bible benevolent societies contributed in ways that we can't even imagine to help with those missionary efforts. So this is from Melder's Ladies' Bountiful Organized Women's Benevolence in Early 19th Century America. You'll find a link to this in the show notes as well. Quote, the missionary impulse spread quickly into New York State, where the Female Missionary Society of the Western District, organized in 1816, maintained 6 missionaries and raised more than $2,000 in the year 1818 from 46 towns and villages in 10 counties. The religious crusade stimulated the growth of centralized, non-sectarian, national organizations dedicated to the circulation of Bibles and tracts, and many women's societies became affiliates of the national groups. New Hampshire's female Bible societies numbered 138 local groups at the height of their activities in 1828. In 1817, the managers of the American Bible Society paid tribute to their lady assistants. Now quoting the American Bible Society, quote, it would be an act of injustice to that sect to contribute so essentially to the relief of our cares, whilst they heighten our purest pleasures, not to notice in a prominent manner. Their active benevolence in aid of the society, not only in forming auxiliaries, but also in constituting in so many places their pastors' members for life. They thus manifest the sense which they cherish of their obligations to that holy volume, the Bible, whose truths have elevated them in Christian lands to their just and all-important station in society, and qualified them to perform the duties of that station with honor and success. End quote. So with that social context in mind, and these women's and female and benevolence and relief societies cropping up, let's consider what Emma said about other benevolent societies. She said that the Washingtonian Benevolent Society was one of the most corrupt institutions of the day. Just think about this in the abstract for a minute. Women represented a major untapped block of social power. Women's role in politics until 1920 was the values she raised her male children with, who would eventually vote on her behalf once that boy reached voting age. However, voting is just one aspect of social power and affecting social change. And it turns out that organizing grassroots social movements was something that women were really good at doing in 19th century America. Imagine that, right? But these groups took on social issues of the day, mostly temperance, as it was the most prominent issue which impacted so many women on a day-to-day basis. But beyond the social movements, though, these societies offered that intangible sense of sorority and cohesion in a world where women had no power to directly affect social change through voting. They also provided times when the women could leave their kids and their husbands, just go hang out with their friends away from all the annoyance of children, husbands, and the daily grind of chores to distract them. Now, it's interesting to note that the organization of the Female Relief Society in Nauvoo was formed in a similar fashion as other female societies of the day, that is, by the approval and dictates of the ruling brethren in the area. I mean, the Female Relief Society was only formed when Joseph Smith and John Taylor gave their approval of it and ordained the women there to be in charge of the society. The women didn't form it of their own volition. Taylor even tried to name it contrary to what the president, Emma, of the Relief Society wanted to name it, and she had to debate him to get it to be named the Relief Society instead of the Benevolence Society of Nauvoo. Once the Relief Society was formed, it was kept on a very short leash by the Mormon leadership. Almost every meeting of the society for the first few months had a keynote speech by Joe or by another high-ranking Mormon like Father Newell K. Whitney or Heber the Creeper Kimball. Either that or Joe would have Emma read out a statement to the women that he had prepared. Now, sure, the women controlled what happened in these various societies, including the Nauvoo Relief Society, but they were usually forced to run everything through local male leadership, like the Brethren. Beyond that, if any of the societies wanted to affect societal change that ran against the will of local churches or government, what could they do? If these female societies opposed any powerful male societies that were the status quo of the day, who do you think usually won that debate? Nevertheless, female groups did represent opportunities to curry women's favor in a given demographic, which made the societies vulnerable to being co-opted by local politicians or religious leaders. I mean, think about it. That female missionary society that Melder talked about was able to raise $2,000 in a year's time from 46 villages and townships, all from women who wanted to spread the Bible to the unwashed natives. That's a lot of dough from a large swath of land, all funneled through a group advocating for social changes run exclusively by women. That mass of untapped social and voting power was awfully appealing. So any politician worth their salt would recognize the utility or, conversely, the danger of such a cohesive group of women devoted to social change. Women's societies had to be kept on a short leash, or they might actually accomplish something counter to what the men wanted. It was this constant interplay between men's and women's societies. Beyond that, the corruption inevitably seeped its way into most of these organizations. Imagine that, money and absolute power corrupt absolutely. It's a phenomenon that unfortunately transcends all races, genders, and cultures. But even with this short leash granted by the Brethren, it didn't stop the Nauvoo Relief Society from causing change in their own ways. Case in point, Bennett's brothel. John C. Reckitt Bennett owned a brothel in Nauvoo. A man with his knowledge of intoxicating herbs, party herbs we might call them, usually on hand in brothels, obstetrics, and salesmanship, along with a set of morals that were always for sale to the highest bidder, few men in Nauvoo were better suited to own and manage a brothel than John C. Bennett. Now, the historical record of his house of ill repute is scant, to say the least. In a city championing piety to any outside observers, to have a public brothel definitely didn't help with the circulating rumors of rampant adultery and sexual experimentation within Nauvoo City's walls. As Bennett's public persona began waning in early 1842 amidst these rampant adultery rumors, eventually the Mormons could no longer deal with having a permanent standing brothel in town right next to one of their meeting houses, and they eventually acted. we can be sure that the newly formed Relief Society played a major role in what transpired. But before we get to what did transpire, a question exists here. Let's see if we can play around with this question for a few minutes. How was a brothel able to operate in Nauvoo? I mean, this is the hub of Mormonism, the holy, pious Mormonism. How could this be possible? Why was it allowed to be there in the first place? This is actually a really good question to ask those believing loved ones because it's really unconventional and it doesn't deal with the typical points of argumentation about the books of Mormon or Abraham or polygamy or something to that effect. Those common little jabs that ex-Mormons, anti-Mormons, whatever, like to throw. This is just pure logic and facts to come to some uncomfortable possible conclusions that can be reached via Socratic method. So how was a brothel able to operate in Nauvoo? Let me walk you through why this is a fun line of questioning in my mind to broach with a believing loved one. And I'm going to arm you with the facts to feel comfortable having this conversation should the situation present itself. Joseph Smith was the sole leader of everything in Nauvoo. Okay, I can't overstate that. The only person with a higher government office than him was John C. Bennett prior to his resignation on May 19, 1842. But Joe held the highest ecclesiastical position in the church, and his will became law. John C. Bennett was beholden to Joseph Smith. This was the structure of the Nauvoo government since the elections held in February of 1841. Mayor John C. Bennett, councilors Joseph Smith, Hiram Smith, Sidney Rigdon, Charles C. Rich, John Barnett, Wilson Law, Don Carlos Smith, another Smith brother, John Green, Vincent Knight. And then we have aldermen William Marks, Samuel H. Smith, Daniel Wells, and Newell K. Whitney. Some of you may recognize a few of those names. There may be a few of you listening who recognize all of those names, but just to let you know, Daniel Wells is the only non-Mormon in that group. But he was a Jack Mormon, and he was keeping up appearances. He was the token non-Mormon who was extremely friendly to Joe and the Mormons. All church authority rested in the hands of Joseph Smith as prophet, seer, and revelator, and every member of the Nauvoo government looked to Joseph Smith for direction. All public works projects were divinely commanded by God through his self-proclaimed prophet, the mouthpiece on the planet. Nothing happened in Nauvoo without the knowledge and approval of the Mormon mob boss, Don Joseph Smith. Beyond that, he was Lieutenant General of the Nauvoo Legion, so anything that he couldn't accomplish by government or divine dictate, the Nauvoo Legion or the local police force would handle the problem, often under the cover of nightfall. Joe was the sole authority running Nauvoo. So if he was the pious prophet of God, as so often asserted by believing member or apologist or whoever, why did he allow a brothel to exist in the city? Why didn't he stop it from opening? Or if he didn't know about it when he eventually did learn of its existence, why didn't he immediately close it? Now, here is a set of historical facts that you need to know if a conversation does happen to spawn from this line of questioning. Now, the timing on all of these facts is important, as is the source from which the information derives. So hang in there with me for a few minutes while I create a bit of a timeline in discussing the vice-ridden underbelly of Nauvoo. When the charter was passed in late 1840, a temperance bill was argued soon after, which banned the sale of non-medicinal alcohol within the city limits. In response to the passage of this bill, action was taken, published in the Times and Seasons on the 15th November, 1841. Bennett was in good standing in the church at this time. He was living in a room of Joe and Emma's house and regarded as Joe's closest bosom friend at this time. Okay? Having long since replaced Sidney Rigdon, who had replaced Oliver Cowdery, John C. Bennett was basically the second in command. This is from the Times and Seasons, 15th November 1841. Quote, "The nuisance! It is known to many of our patrons that a certain young man, very injudiciously and contrary to the remonstrances, yes, that is apparently a 19th century word, of his friends, and in violation of the ordinances of this city, not long since erected a small building near the Temple Square, avowedly for the purpose of transacting the business of a grocer. Said building was for a short time occupied for that purpose, but so heavy did the frown of public disapprobation rest upon it that it was finally vacated, and stood some time a lonely wreck of folly. In the meantime, the very sanctimonious and extremely unfortunate Mr. Kilbourne of Montrose threw out to the public ungentlemanly and slanderous imputations concerning the matter, saying that the presidency of the church abetted and approbated the concern, etc., and the building having become a monument for every fool to ride upon and exhibit his folly to the annoyance of the citizens, the city council very judiciously ordered the building removed as a nuisance. Now, let me just clarify. So this guy owned a grocer. That's a shop for alcohol and other vice. And the building vacated because the people didn't like it there. They were a temperate society, apparently. So it just became an empty building, and people, started writing graffiti all over it, and they declared that it was a nuisance. Now it continues. Some opposition to the execution of this order was exhibited, and the authorities called out a few of the military and demolished the building. Dun, dun, dun. The city authorities manifested determination to carry out strictly the temperance ordinances of the city, and in this we wish them Godspeed. We suppose, however, that Kilbourne and his junto will bray worse than ever, and Mormonism be adjudged by witch law. Now, just to be clear, like I said, grocers in the 19th century terminology, that means a store for alcohol of all sorts and tobacco and other psychoactive herbs, not what we consider grocery stores today. So a grocer near the temple violated the city temperance ordinances that Bennett so vociferously fought to put in place because he was a teetotaler, probably because it was popular with the ladies, and he was an insufferable ladies' man. The article specifically claims that it was because of the temperance ordinances that the building was declared a nuisance and destroyed. We'll get into this in a minute, but this establishment has been falsely conflated with Bennett's brothel by historians before. Most notably, Richard Price's book, Joseph Smith Fought Polygamy, is a bit reckless with the timing here, and we'll get into that in just a second here. But what is most notable is that Bennett's brothel actually was destroyed. This is how it happened. There was a resolution passed on May 14th, 1842. A month and a half before Bennett began his crusade against Joe and the Mormons. But he'd kind of begun his departure, okay? He resigned less than a week after this resolution was passed from the office of mayor, and he'd basically already tendered his membership resignation by this point. This is from the History of the Church, Dan Vogel edition, volume 5, page 8. Quote, of course, everything. Just to reiterate, the history of the church, it's all written from Joseph Smith's firsthand perspective, although almost none of these documents are from Joseph Smith himself. Quote, I attended city council in the morning and advocated strongly the necessity of some active measures being taken to suppress houses and acts of infamy in the city for the protection of the innocent and virtuous and good of public morals, showing clearly that there were certain characters in the place who were disposed to corrupt the morals and chastity of our citizens, and that houses of infamy did exist, upon which a city ordinance concerning brothels and disorderly characters was passed to prohibit such things and published in this day's WASP. Now, this is an interesting point as well. I also spoke largely for the repeal of the ordinance of the city licensing merchants, hawkers, taverns, and ordinaries, desiring that this might be a free people and enjoy equal rights and privileges, and the ordinances were repealed. End quote. Here's the WASP article that it talked about. Quote, an ordinance concerning brothels and disorderly characters, section 1st. Be it ordained by the city council of the city of Nauvoo that all brothels or houses of ill fame erected or being in the city of Nauvoo be and the same hereby are henceforth prohibited and by law declared public nuisances, and that the owners or keepers of such houses be fined in a sum of not less than $500 nor more than $50,000 and imprisoned for 6 months for each offense of 1 day's continuance of such establishment, and that any person frequenting such establishments except on lawful business, nice little exception, shall be fined in the sum of $500 and 6 months imprisonment for each offense. And further, that for every act of adultery or fornication which can be proved, how do you prove that? The parties shall be imprisoned 6 months and fined each then it's hard to read because the printing on it is really bad on archive.org. The sum from $500 to $50,000, and that the individual's own acknowledgement shall be considered sufficient evidence in the case. That is signed by John C. Bennett, Mayor. Approved May 14th, 1842. Approved by John C. Reckitt Bennett, and then he probably walked out of the meeting with his middle fingers flying. As soon as he got home, he must have written down his resignation from the office of mayor. And I know it probably wasn't quite literally that timing, but pretty close to it. This was Bennett's last order as mayor of the city of Nauvoo, an ordinance commanding that brothels and houses of ill fame be disbanded or destroyed, and the owners be fined $500 to $50,000. Now, I couldn't find any evidence readily available of whether or not Bennett paid a fine for being the owner of such a business of ill fame, but it was passed and his brothel was immediately destroyed. Beyond that, in the same meeting this ordinance was passed, Joe was able to repeal the temperance ordinances on the city as well. Those same temperance ordinances that Bennett fought so hard to get put in place. So Bennett's and Joe's relationship, whatever was left before that council meeting, completely melted down in that meeting. To be a fly on the wall, to see that argument play out, what joy that would be. Bennett's power had completely been neutered by Joe, and the temperance order that he had fought for and the brothel that he had built a successful business on, all of that undone in a single meeting. No wonder Bennett hated Joe so much. Joe was a total power-hungry bastard, and he flexed his muscles in this meeting. Details of the destruction of Bennett's brothel are unfortunately weak in the historical record. Bennett was so quickly scrubbed from the historical record in any way possible that as soon as he left the Mormon community, he largely departed from the collective memory of most Mormons at the time. His contributions to the movement and foundation of Nauvoo have been minimized since mid-1842, but some details did come to light, and here they are. During the temple lot hearings in the mid-1890s, a man named John Taylor, now that's not the Brighamite prophet John Taylor, he was dead by the 1890s. This is a different John Taylor of the RLDS sect of Mormonism, told a few details of the Nauvoo brothel that he recalled from his teenage years living in the town. This account comes as a court testimonial, so that's good, but it's nearly 50 years after the fact from a believer in Mormonism who saw Bennett and the Fosters, they make a little cameo here, as mortal enemies of Joseph Smith for their respective roles in destroying his character. Bennett for his expose and lecturing against the Mormons, and the Fosters for their role in publishing the Nauvoo Expositor, which led to the death of Joseph Smith. So here's Taylor's testimony. It's a bit biased, to say the least. Quote, I stated that at one time I watched John C. Bennett go into a house that had a bad reputation, and I reported that fact when I caught him. That was in the year 1842, sometime in the latter part of the season. John C. Bennett and a lot of them built an ill-famed house near the temple in Nauvoo, and there was a meeting ground in the grove near there. After they had built it, John C. Bennett and the Fosters, I knew all their names at the time, they were the head men of it. After they got it built, they wrote on it in large letters what it was, a sign declaring what it was and what it was there for, but I don't remember just what the inscription or sign was they put on it. When they went to go to meeting, we could not get there without passing this house and looking right at it. For it was close to the meeting ground, and 1,000 or 2,000 people would go there to meeting on a Sabbath, and they didn't feel very good seeing that house there with great big letters facing them when they would look at it. Now, once Bennett became the problem that he was, the citizens of Nauvoo lobbied to have that house of ill fame removed. According to the timing claimed by John Taylor almost 50 years after the fact, and I need to say that again, this would have been a few months after the formation of the Female Relief Society. Should his timing be accurate, this may have been one of the very first social projects that the women banded together to accomplish, for understandable reasons, okay? Maybe they were sick of too many nights of a truant husband, right? Maybe too many of them were Julia Danvers and were sick of it. We're going to discuss the limitations of Taylor's testimony in just a minute here, but this is how the citizens of Nauvoo dealt with Bennett's brothel, according to Taylor. The city council held a council over it, and they considered it was a nuisance to the city, and the authorities passed an ordinance against it and notified them to move the nuisance, but they did not pay any attention to the order. They had some furniture in it, not much. The police gathered around, and one of the policemen went to go in to move some of the furniture or something that was in it. And John Eagle, a big, burly-looking fellow, hit the policeman and knocked him down. They went in and took the building and put it on rollers. And there was a deep gully there, and they pitched the house into the gully. Just rolled the house off and tipped it over into this gully, shingles and all. And that was the end of that transaction. And unfortunately, that's all the historical record has to offer us concerning Bennett's brothel. At least that's all I could find. You know, there's inevitably more out there that I couldn't find, and I need to be clear about that. But let's just evaluate how valuable this testimony is. It's a fun testimony, right? I mean, he tells an exciting story from his memory, but is it trustworthy as a historical source? As I stated a couple times, it was given 50 years after the occurrence. Beyond that, Taylor went on in the same statement to claim that Joseph and Hiram were never practicing polygamy, which perjured himself on the stand. That casts his entire testimony into serious question. Also, he was a staunch believer in Joseph Smith as the prophet and his son Joseph Smith III as the current prophet. And Taylor likely never could see any possible wrong that Joe could have done, right? Much like the majority of believers throughout all of Mormon history. His religion, the RLDS, had a vested interest in proving that Joe was a monogamist, as the majority of scholarship falling on that side of the spectrum has come out of the RLDS tradition. That reveals a religious conflict of interest with respect to him making certain claims or interpreting certain evidence in a way which would not be critical to Joseph Smith, which even further limits his credibility. The timing is also an issue. He claimed that it happened in the latter part of 1842 when Bennett was doing his lecture circuit against the church, but there doesn't exist any article in the Times of Seasons or the History of Church that I can find which alludes to this specific instance happening in late 1842 when they supposedly tossed Bennett's brothel into that gully. In fact, there isn't any article detailing the destruction of a building of ill fame except in November of 1841, and that was the grocery store that was selling alcohol against city regulations. That wasn't a brothel. And that's the only article that even close to fits the bill for what John Taylor claimed in the Temple Lot hearings concerning this house of ill fame. That's the only one that I could find anyway, and I searched fairly thoroughly in my opinion. There may be something out there that I, skipped past my gaze. However, the timing of that November 1841 article is extremely problematic. Bennett was still in good standing with the church in November 41. Even if there happened to be, maybe some murmurings of problems that wouldn't fully gestate until April and May of the next year when he resigned. However, the location fits in general terms. Both Taylor's testimony and the November 1841 article claim the building in question was near the temple, but that's the only point where there's agreement. Also, the 1841 article makes no mention of a police officer being assaulted, as Taylor had claimed. You think that would make it into there. The article also says the building had been erected and then vacated, which that may be a euphemism for it being inhabited only by those people of ill fame who would need such a house, but that's only inference, and it's speculative at best. Beyond that, the article says it was a Mr. Kilbourne who owned the grocer, and there is nothing tying Bennett to it whatsoever that would link this article from 1841 to the testimony given by Taylor in the Temple Lot hearings. So, did Bennett own a brothel in Nauvoo with a big XXX sign on it right next to the temple that was then put on rollers and pitched into a gully when the ordinance banning brothels was passed? Well, it's kind of likely that he owned a brothel at least, even if the details of its destruction and whatnot are a little fuzzy. He had all of the skills and know-how to create a successful sex work business, and he had the obstetric skills necessary to, keep the women in working order. Yeah. Even gave myself a little shudder at that. But regardless, should Taylor's testimony be granted as historical fact? No. Okay? There's just too many holes and conflicts of interest for it to be trustworthy. The limitations in Taylor's testimony hasn't stopped historians from using it as historical fact, though. If you read the two Fair Mormon articles concerning Bennett and his brothel, they link the 1841 article and Taylor's testimony together and claim it was Bennett who opposed the removal of the building in that 1841 article. Beyond that, they also cite an article out of the WASP for October 2nd, 1842 as substantiation that Bennett owned that building and that it was a brothel, and then he opposed its removal. Well, there's no issue of the WASP on October 2nd, 1842, and the October 1st and the October 8th issues don't have any articles of the sort. I know, because I read them. What I'm saying is Fair Mormon has these articles online with shoddy and dishonest historical practices, and the citations that are either misinterpreted or they are wholly non-existent when you chase them down. So always check your sources, folks. Now, I know most of you must be balking at the idea that Fair Mormon is using shoddy scholarship. How dare you, Bryce? How dare you say such things? Honestly, though, it's important on this subject. I've been digging for quite some time around about Bennett's brothel, and it's a subject that's not so very open and shut. But why is it important? And why did I introduce this as a line of questioning to try and broach with that believing loved one at a family reunion? I mean, why is that relevant? Why talk about this? This whole story reveals a seedy underbelly of Nauvoo history that isn't the Kinderhook plates or the Book of Abraham or the Masonic initiation rituals. Those are fun, right? This is something on a completely different level. And it reveals a bit of the human element within the story. You see, tensions had been building between Joe and Bennett for a couple of months prior to what happened with Bennett's brothel. This was the final straw. This went down 5 days prior to Bennett's resignation from the office of mayor and membership in the church. The passage of this revolution must have driven that final axe blow that finally rent the trunk of their friendship in twain. Bennett was so viciously opposed to alcohol consumption and was probably making a bit of money off his little spiritual wife business in that brothel, and in one fell swoop, Joe outlawed brothels and repealed the temperance ordinances, making the sale of alcohol legal again, against Bennett's wishes. But it goes much deeper. This was passed on the same day that Orrin Pistol Pack and Porter Rockwell returned from Missouri after having shot ex-Governor Lilburn Boggs. Now, Porter Rockwell wasn't motivated by nice possessions or a lavish lifestyle. He was a mountain man motivated by freedom. If there was one thing that motivated old Port, it was whiskey. Whiskey was expensive and hard to get in a city with temperance laws. Well, Port had just returned from fulfilling prophecy in Missouri, and maybe Joe owed him a little bit of favor to make that whiskey a little easier to obtain within the boundaries of Nauvoo. But there's another level of historical conjecture to get into here. Now, so much of the argument between Joe and Bennett wrapped around the problems created with Bennett's spiritual wifery system, as opposed to Joe's celestial marriage system. Bennett owning a brothel and making money off of sex workers, that's something we can have a conversation about. There's a lot of factors that play into it. Commodifying sexual pleasure is something that humans have been doing for as long as we have written history. It's something that our fellow primates do. But I want to draw a line between Joe and Bennett here when it comes to the commodification of women and sexuality in Nauvoo. Bennett was gaining money off sex workers. What was Joe gaining from his sex workers? Now, why I bring that up is the story of the Kimball family is completely heart-wrenching. We're going to get into the details of that in an episode when our timeline gets there, but essentially, Joe told Heber the Creeper Kimball that he wanted Heber's wife, Violet, as a celestial wife. The Kimballs toiled over this decision for a few days, and they finally came back and said that they'd do it. And then Joe just told them, "Oh, I was just testing you. That was a big joke. I actually want your 14-year-old daughter, Helen Marr." He gained a 14-year-old victim and the undying fealty of his closest followers by commodifying the Kimball family's sexuality. Heber was handsomely rewarded with 43 wives before his death for that undying fealty. Many of those were Joe's wives after he died in 1844. That was just conveniently passed on to Heber the Creeper. But what else did Joe gain? Well, more women with his little Mothers in Israel program, those older polygamous wives who would coerce younger girls into marrying Joseph. Now, let's not be too hasty in thinking that Joe just took these women for his own possession and that was the extent of their sex work services. A visiting dignitary came into town, send him over to one of the rooms in the Nauvoo mansion, and all of his worldly lusts will be satisfied. Let's hear a couple passages about how Joe treated his wives and what he would get them to do, according to Joseph Jackson's account. This is as dark as it gets when it comes to accusations lobbed at Joe. Quote, "Joe's conduct with the women of Nauvoo surpasses everything in blackness that I have ever heard or read of. I have from his own mouth and from the mouth of his victims statements which I dare not reveal, for the world will not believe that such corruption could possibly exist. Yet, if protection could be afforded to some of those females who were the victims of these wretches, the leaders in Nauvoo, I could, I believe, from their own mouths, procure confessions that would startle the world. I have visited frequently those women whom Joe supported for their gratification of his lust. I have found them subsisting on the coarsest food, and not daring to utter a word of complaint, for they feared Joe Smith more than they did their God. I have appealed to the finer feelings of their nature, and seen them weep as children when dwelling on the degraded state to which their credulity had reduced them. Knowing me to be in the confidence of Joe, they hesitated not to unfold their griefs to me, but their neighbors and acquaintances generally know nothing of their feelings or their degradation. These remarks apply only to a portion of the spiritual wives, for there are many who are as corrupt as Joe himself." Later on. But to return to my conversation with Hiram, after giving me his experience in the spiritual wife system, he urged me to take a few women, and named 2 or 3 women who he said would suit me. I thanked him and said I had no desire to form any connection with any women in the city, but if I should change my mind, I would give his choice the preference. Continuing from even later on. I asked Joseph how he would work the matter, to which he replied that he only had to tell certain of his spiritual wives that such a man had been in the Missouri War, and that he should be put out of the way, and his property and money consecrated to the use of the church. Then said he, it is damned easy for them to God on his good graces, and mix a white powder in with his victuals, and put him out of the way. I then told him that he ought to give me the names of these women, as they might be of great service to me in carrying his secret measures. He then went on to give me the names of women, who he said would go to the ends of the earth for him, but I shall not in this place disclose them. End quote. So really, when we're talking about shades of utterly debased blackness, who is more evil here? Bennett making money off sex work, or Joe building a corrupt system of theocratic power by leveraging his sex workers? Bennett sold the sex services of his spiritual wives to satisfy lusts. Joe gave the services of his wives and concubines to men as favors. And, well, I think Marlon Brando captures it pretty well.
If you'd come to me in friendship, then the scum that ruined your daughter would be suffering this very day. And if by chance an honest man like yourself should make enemies, then he would become my enemies. And then they would fear you.
Be my friend? Godfather?
Good. Someday, and that day may never come, I'll call upon you to do a service for me. But until that day, accept this justice as a gift on my daughter's wedding day.
Grazie. Grazie, Father.
Prego.
Everything we've discussed today is one tiny window into Mormon history that reveals a dark and malevolent side of Joseph Smith. Sure, we can throw shade at Bennett's spiritual wife system all day, but it seems that Bennett got out of the game at a good time. I think that Joe scared Bennett the longer that they spent together. I think that just like Joseph Jackson, the more that Bennett was able to see this darker side of Joseph Smith, the more he realized the type of depraved and hideous villain he was working with. Bennett saw the blueprints. He saw the piles of parts lying around behind those closed doors that would eventually comprise Joseph's second revolutionary war machine. So, maybe this isn't a subject to bring up to that family member the next time you get in a conversation about the church or church history. Maybe it isn't a fun line of questioning to walk people down. There be monsters down this rabbit hole. But I think it does reveal aspects of the human condition that exist ubiquitously throughout all human history, across all human cultures. Aspects that we don't want to talk about. We don't want to acknowledge because it might be our neighbor, it might be a friend, a family member. It might be a trusted religious leader who's just the nicest guy you've ever met. A religious leader who could do no wrong. Does that sound familiar to anybody? That's going to do it for today. Huge shout out and thanks to New Name Noah, Mike Norton, as well as McKenna Denson for using that audio clip that was at the beginning of the episode. And of course, the other clip was from The Godfather. With that, we have some new patrons to thank. We have a pledge edit by Colton, a pledge edit by Joe, and then two new patrons. We have Andrea and Lizzie. La la la. La la la, love it. Nicely done. So to all of our new patrons, thank you so much for joining us at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. And if you're interested, everybody, and you want to sign up, you're getting the Namo Book Club every Monday right now. That's what we're glomming onto for the next few months, at least. That is the seedy underbelly that John C. Bennett exposed when he disaffected from the church and went on his public preaching and writing circuit. That's his expose. We are reading through it on the Namo Book Club. Of course, you can get access to that for the cost of a coffee a month. So if you think that you can spare a coffee a month, go ahead and head over to patreon.com/nakedmormonism, punch that in there, and we will, I'll thank you on the next episode. And of course, patron subscribers also get extended editions of every episode. I know that we've been hanging out for a long time, but I want to talk about what happened at the Fast and Testimony meeting on September 1st. It was very interesting. Personally, I went and bore my testimony, have a lot of my own thoughts to share, and of course, McKenna Denson went to the actual ward of Joseph Bishop and testified there, or bore her testimony. There's a lot to talk about. So if you are a patron subscriber, be sure to listen in after the concluding music and you'll get that extended piece. You get to hear about my personal experience and my thoughts on this last Fast and Testimony meeting and the excommunication of Sam Young. So with all of that, of course, I want to thank all of the listeners for hitting the download button and keeping us afloat. And I don't think I've said this in a while, but if you're enjoying the show, it really helps our metrics if you head on over to whatever whatever podcast app you use, Podbean, Podcast Addict, iTunes, Stitcher, any of those, and give us a 5-star review. It really, really helps in rankings, helps us with visibility, and helps us hit more feeds and more people's ears. So we'd really appreciate that. And I keep saying the royal we in all of this. I feel like I'm Sidney Rigdon recounting everything in the second person. I personally, Bryce Blankenegel, I would really appreciate that very much. And that helps to grow and expand the audience of the show. So if you do that, thank you so much. If you haven't done that yet, it'd be really cool if you did. With that, let's go ahead and shut it down for the night. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as production assistant and director of social media, and Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer. Music is produced by Jason Camo from aloststateofmind.com and is used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnome Studios, LLC, copyright 2018, all rights reserved.